Okay, recording has started. Okay, so we're basically going over how to deploy Game 2048 onto both clusters using the KubeStellar core that we have installed. So what me and Ricky did, essentially we began with the documentation that is on the KubeStellar website. So we first set up so we first exported the variable. We did the bash curl instructions. Um, um, don't do this instruction because we want our cluster to be called kind flex and not flex. So here you can see I changed it back. And then here I just double checked it and make sure it was in my context. And here we do the Helm upgrade. And yep, and then this instruction was not in the documentation, but we also need to do this command, which I ran here. Now, after doing this command, we then proceed to run this command, which I did here. And then we could verify our installation by doing this command. We are able to see what is everything in our namespace basically. Okay, now we are on to registering our clusters through the WEC documentation. So first, if you look at the documentation, we first create two clusters. Right here, as you can see, then I double checked it with kubectx. I also double checked it with kind cluster. Now we do this command to register both cluster 1 and cluster 2. Cluster 1 should be relatively quick. Cluster 2, you may need to run this a couple times for it to be registered. And we complete the registration process by doing these two commands. And this will show that we have registered our cluster. And we could double check. And now Ricky will go over the next steps.
Okay. Let's see, where did we leave off at? Application group. Okay. Next, we want to use the documentation about the example scenarios. We will run the first command, which is the qcts context apply, where we apply a binding policy, which is on the very bottom. When we create this policy, next we want to run the very next command, which will deploy the app. Yeah, according to this command right there. So now we want to check if we're in the right what was it? The right clusters, the right context. So we're currently in cluster 2. And next we want to check that if our nginx is working, because that is what we're using to make sure that we can deploy game 2048. So we did kget all-n nginx, and it looks like everything is working. So we switch over to cluster 1 to check if nginx is working and is also working. So what we want to do now is that we want to switch to kind qflex. So do qctx kind qflex, and this will be our core, like our remote, well, not remote, but our local. So we want to check the namespace. So do kget ns, we get all the namespaces, and as you can see, game 2048 is not in the namespaces, but we see ingress nginx. Then what we want to do is apply the game 2048 YAML file onto the kind qflex. So we do qctl apply game 2048 YAML. This will create a namespace of game 2048. Then we want to change our context to WDS1, which is our work deployment cluster or context. And we want to add a binding policy. So we do qctl context WDS1 apply -fbp. After we create the binding policy, we can switch back to cluster 1 to check if game 2048 is deployed onto that cluster. And as you can see, when we get the namespace, it is there. We also want to do the same thing for cluster 2 to see it's working over there. Then let's see. Next, we do a get all for game 2048 namespace, and you can see that we have the service and the deployment. Currently, we have no port as a type, and we want to change that. We don't want to use that, so me and Benson will be working to fix that error. Next, we did hey get all dash n the namespace, which is game 2048, and your result should look something like this. Don't worry if the deployment is not ready. It's 0 out of 5. That's completely fine. Next, we want to check the service and the deployment. So we run those two commands of this using kdescribe, and we can see like the name, the labels, annotation, all the different elements of what we just put in. And yeah, that should help you deploy game 2048. And our next task is to be able to show that it appears, well, we want to show that game 2048 is available on both cluster 1 and cluster 2 visually.
Yep. In the next video, we will complete the instructions and we will revise the port type, and we will be able to showcase game 2048 on cluster 1 and cluster 2 on 2 different routes.
Yeah, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out in Slack.
And while we went through this very briefly, most of the in-depth knowledge could be found within the documentation, or you can just ask. In the second part of this video, we'll be showing how we can open game 2048 on 2 different browsers that we have deployed onto our clusters using KubeStellar. To do this, let's first check that our namespace or your namespace is the same as mine. So to do that, let's move CTX into our clusters, and we could use k get ns to check our names. We could do that for cluster 1, cluster 2, and WDS. Okay. If our cluster is the same, we can move on to actually opening game 2048 on our browser. To open game 2048 on our browser, there's 2 ways we could do this. We could do this by getting the external IP and through exposing that external IP using inputs, or we could do it through port forwarding. But if I do get all this command, you will see that we do not have an external IP because it was not built into a kind cluster, which we're using for this demonstration. So instead, I'll be using the port forwarding. So to do that, we could take this command. Oh, right. We need to be in our clusters to run this command. So cluster 1. Then we run this command. Yep. And then now we open a separate terminal instance, and we could do the same thing, but in a different cluster. So since I did the other one in cluster 1, we could do this in cluster 2, and we could run the same cluster, but remember to change the port number because we don't want to have any conflict. Okay. Go to our browser, go to localhost, then you see that it's open in our localhost that we declared, and then we could do the same here. and both are running on two different. So one of these is for cluster one, and one of these is for cluster two, and both of these are deployed using KubeStellar. Our next step is to try to have some way or figure out some way to expose the Ingress service so that we could use the external IP rather than using port forwarding to open game 2040 onto our browser.